My brothers and sisters and friends, I know you will forgive me if I have some feelings of anxiety and apprehension in approaching this assignment this morning. Actually, in a sense, it is sort of a homecoming. And as I look around at the faces of many friends, it is a comforting thought. In these stake presidents, I see many who on various occasions have been my hosts as I have had the pleasure of being in their homes, to kneel with them in family prayer and participate in their conference activities. That's always been a great source of inspiration to me, to see the great uniformity of quality of the leadership of this church no matter where you go. There are other visitors here this morning that give a great source of comfort and satisfaction, one of whom is my mother, who is here from California, and I would like to have her stand if she would. I think I was absent from the particular faculty meeting where President Wilkinson asked for a volunteer for this assignment. But after I received it, I thought it would be nice to pass the privilege on to someone else. But I was advised that my powers of delegation had just been cut off. As a matter of truth, however, this is a great privilege to share these few minutes with you. For a number of reasons, this is one of the most distinguished audiences in the world. And it is an honor to address you, almost an overwhelming one. We come to college for a great variety of reasons, all of them exciting ones. And I think one of those motivations is the adventure of discovering new things, new associations, new friends, new truths, and about new inventions. And it's also satisfying that we can be assured that no one has ever gotten a monopoly on truth, and so there'll be lots of wonderful new things to discover here. In fact, the accumulation of knowledge is sort of a relative thing. Brother Benny Lewis often tells one of his favorite stories, which I would like to repeat, about the two men arguing over their knowledge of the Bible. And one of them said, I'm sure I know more about the Bible than you do. And the other one says, I'll bet you $10 you don't. And the other one says, well, I'll bet you $10 that you don't even know the Lord's Prayer. And the other one says, I'll take that. And both of them put up their money. All right, the first one says, let's hear you say it. So the man said, now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my soul will keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul will take. His friend looked at him in astonishment, picked up the money, handed it to him, and said, I didn't think you knew it. Very often we hear the question, what is education for? And I would like to present this morning for your consideration a statement, a definition made by a famous American. He said, education is the power to think clearly, the power to do well in the world's work, and the power to appreciate life. You will notice that in this definition there are three objectives. We have a special committee here on the campus that is attempting to codify the objectives of this university, and I would submit that we are going to have a difficult time equaling the sublime simplicity of the objectives stated in that particular definition. Who was the great American who gave that definition of education? It was Brigham Young, the man whose name this university memorializes, made that statement. that education is the power to think clearly. And every class we take and every fact we learn is designed to give us additional tools to increase that power to think clearly. And secondly, it is the power to do well in the world's work. The man who made that statement had a mind like a diamond, for he knew that whatever a man does, whether it's farming cabbages or triggering a hydrogen explosion, it is part of the world's work. And our purpose here is to gain the tools to do well in our part of the world's work. And then finally, the power to appreciate life. And there isn't a part of this institution that doesn't have as part of its assignment the aiding of students in the appreciation of life. Well, at the time of Brigham Young, there was a tendency to ridicule education. I've picked up some other definitions of education that are somewhat interesting. I have a large manuscript here so that you'd be relieved when I didn't read it. But I do want to be sure that I quote this one properly. One person said, "What is the reason for having colleges and universities? They are for the rehabilitation of the physically unfit." In other words, if you're a normal person with natural physical capacities, you got a job. Otherwise, you went to college. Here's another one. Education is that which enables a man to get along in life even though he may not have much intelligence. And then he dryly added, and intelligence is that which enables a man to succeed in life without education. But when Brigham Young was asked the purpose of education, he had a quick reply. The improvement of the mind, to instruct us in all arts and sciences, in the history of the world, in the laws of nations, to enable us to understand the laws and principles of life and how to be useful while we live. You will see from this that to Brigham Young, education was not a phase of life. It was a way of life. It was an attitude toward life. And to him it was the golden path to eternal progression. I think we are honored to carry the name of Brigham Young on the banner of this university. Actually, he only had 11 days of formal education himself. But he had a great deal of informal education. He says, we never had the opportunity of letters in our youth, but we had the privilege of picking up brush, chopping down trees, rolling logs, and working amongst the roots and getting our shins, feet, and toes bruised. I wore a straw hat which I frequently braided for myself. I learned how to make bread, wash dishes, milk the cows, and make butter, and can make butter and beat most of the women in this community at housekeeping. These are about all the advantages I gained in my youth. Back in Washington, I was giving a church history lesson one day, and there was a young lady sitting in the front row that didn't seem to be particularly interested, and her mind wandered until I read that description. And as I finished it, she looked up and said, "Who was that fellow?" I think she thought he would have made a good husband. Brigham Young, you know, was born in 1801 at Whittingham, Vermont, on a worn-out farm. All the farms were worn out in Vermont. They had been farmed for over 200 years. A little further north, the family that was later to have Joseph Smith as a member was also trying to succeed on a farm that was worn out. Not far away was another family, the parents of Heber C. Kimball. And then in another direction there was the family named Cowdery. All of these families finally left Vermont and went west to the wheat belt. The great new wheat belt of America was at that time in western New York, and the center of it was Palmyra. And all of these families settled in the vicinity of Palmyra. Brigham Young's home during the early period of his life was about 45 to 50 miles from Palmyra, down near one of the Finger Lakes. At 14, Brigham Young lost his mother. And as was the custom in those days, a boy was put out to work, to learn a trade. And some of them had very cruel experiences. Brigham Young, however, had the kind of a personality which attracted to him opportunities that did not come to an ordinary boy. He lived in several towns and worked as a tradesman, and in each of those towns he is still remembered for good things. He is remembered as the boy who organized a fire brigade and saved the local mill when he was just a youth. He's remembered as the boy who dived into a racing mill stream and rescued the body of a youngster who had drowned. He is remembered for having invented a paint-making machine, one that ground the pigments to pieces automatically as a result of a certain amount of inventive genius. He is remembered as a good speaker, though he was uneducated in speaking as such. He was liked by people. And one of the local residents afterwards visited Salt Lake City, a man named D.B. Smith, and he said Brigham Young was as fine a specimen of young manhood as I have ever known, and would have made his mark in whatever community his lot might have been cast. Well, he had to work hard, and at the age of 23 he married a lovely girl, blonde, wavy hair, and bright blue eyes, and to them was born 2 baby daughters. Later he wanted to be closer to his family, and so he moved to Mendon, New York. Mendon is about 15 miles from Palmyra. By this time, 3 of Brigham Young's older brothers had become preachers for the Methodist Church. His sister Rhoda had married a man by the name of Green, who was also a minister. In order to appreciate the relationship there, we also ought to remind ourselves that Susanna, his older sister, who had married, had a daughter, and her name was Valete Murray. And at the age of 17, she married one of Brigham Young's best friends, Heber C. Kimball. This helps to explain the very close relationship between Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, who were closely associated all their lives. Now, it was in this setting that Brigham Young first heard about Joseph Smith and the gospel. He was very slow to join this church. He had to be absolutely sure. He was a very practical turn of mind. In his earlier days, he had been associated with 2 other very practical men. They tell about the 3 wise boys from the East at Port Byron, New York. One of them Brigham Young, one of them Henry Wells, later famous as the head of the Wells Fargo Company, and another man named Isaac Singer, who gave the Singer sewing machine to the world as a boon to humanity. These 3 were good friends at Port Byron. And so Brigham Young, being of a practical turn of mind and attracted to practical things, was very slow to respond to things that were not available to the senses. You remember that one of the first books of Mormon ever distributed by Samuel Smith, the younger brother of Joseph Smith, was to Reverend Green. And Reverend Green was going to distribute it and see if anybody wanted to buy it as he went on the circuit. Nobody did. So Samuel just left the book there in the house with Rhoda Green, sister of Brigham Young. And then one of the ministers of the family, one of the preachers, Phineas Young, Joseph's older brother, bought a copy. And he gave that book to Brigham Young, and when Brigham had finished reading it, he said to Phineas, "There is something to Mormonism." It will be 2 years before he joins the church. In the meantime, the church moved to Kirtland, Ohio, and there's where its headquarters were established. But in 1831, in the fall of that year, there came to Mendon 5 missionaries. And they taught the gospel there, and that's where Brigham Young heard it. And he noticed that one of them particularly enjoyed the gift of tongues. This man could speak in a language he had never learned, just exactly the way they did in the New Testament times. There was a man in the audience who was able to understand the language, and he was amazed that these rustics could speak the language so well, and a moment later another one rise up and interpret it, who also did not have the academic training to understand that language. And this man, whose name was Colburn, if I recall correctly, said, "I don't understand how they're able to do it, but I certainly won't accept it as an evidence of the divinity of this work." Brigham Young was more thoughtful than that. He had to know more about this. And so when these missionaries had gone back down home, he and his father and some others went down and listened to them down at Columbia, Pennsylvania, which was their residence. He came back and thought about it some more. He read some more. Then he went up to see his older brother, Joseph Young. And he said, "Come on down and look this thing over." And then his father and his brother, and I think Phineas, went down to Columbia. And when Joseph got close to it, he said, this is Joseph Young, "This is the truth." And they were all baptized. And then they came back with 2 of the missionaries, and on the 14th of April, 1832, Brigham Young was baptized, a member of this church. He had to walk 2 miles from the stream back to his home, tromping through the snow, even though it was April. They had some blustery storms. His clothes were still wet on his back as he came into the house, and the elder who was there said, "Brother Young, sit down, and I will ordain you an elder after the order of Melchizedek in the restored church of Jesus Christ." And so that happened. A few months after that, Brigham Young lost his lovely wife. She died of quick consumption. She was baptized just a short time before it happened. And then he placed his 2 little girls in the custody of the wife of Heber C. Kimball, and several of them set out for Kirtland, Ohio to see Joseph Smith. They found the prophet Joseph with his brothers out in the woods cutting lumber. This isn't the way you expect to find a man called of God in modern times. It's the way they were in the ancient times, though. And Brigham Young said that as he shook hands with this young fellow, now what, in his 26th year, 27th year, he felt the Spirit of God manifest to him that he was shaking hands with one with a divine calling. That night, Joseph Smith called upon Brigham Young to pray. And as they knelt down together and Brigham Young began to pray, the gift of tongues came upon him. And he gave the rest of his prayer in a language no one understood in the room. And when he stood up, and this was the first time Joseph Smith had ever heard this gift in this day and age, the brethren clamored around him and said, "What was that?" And Joseph said, "It was of God. For while he was on his knees, he received a special revelation." And a little later, when Brigham Young was out of the room, he said to the brethren, "That man will one day head this church." I only have time to refer to 1 or 2 other things to remind us of the greatness of Brigham Young. While he was in Mendon, New York, before he moved to Kirtland, he was in the business of making roughed furniture. He had a little sawmill that he geared up with water power, and he would make furniture and put it together. When Brother John A. Widsoe and his wife, a granddaughter of Brigham Young, visited Mendon, New York in 1920, they looked around among the old-timers to see if anybody remembered anything about Brigham Young. Did they remember him? Of course they did. And they remembered him for good things. There were hundreds of pieces of furniture still being used, which he had made. And one old-timer, an elderly lady, was out there on her porch one day, and when they walked up to her, they asked her about Brigham Young, and was he an honest man? And she said, "Well, see that rocking chair? My grandmother sunned herself in that chair every good day while she was alive, and when she died, my mother did the same, and now I use it every good day. That chair is nearly 100 years old. Brigham Young made it. I don't think a man who could have made so honest a chair would have been anything but an honest man. In the year 1838 and 39, 15,000 Latter-day Saints were evicted from $2 million worth of property in Missouri under the orders from the governor to be massacred or move. And the majority of them had time to move, but not all. At Haun's Mill, men, women, and children were shot down. And the very next night, 2,000 mob militia surrounded the city of Far West. Brigham Young was there that night. He watched his babies. He had since remarried. He watched his lovely wife. Tomorrow there may be another Haun's Mill at Far West. He knew the terrors of mob violence. But the next day, Joseph Smith and his associates, other than Brigham Young, were betrayed into the hands of the mob and were sent to prison. And for a moment, it lifted the pressure from that community. And they all prepared to leave Missouri as fast as they could. It fell to Brigham Young to lead them out. My heart is touched as I read the description of his desire to help not only his own babies and his own wife and loved ones, but everyone, particularly the poor and the weak and the helpless. He called on the bishop and said, "Are you going to have energy and time to help the poor?" And this bishop says, "I'm going to help myself. Let the poor help themselves." Then President Young said, "As president of the Quorum of the 12, I therefore assume the responsibility that you are giving up. It's your stewardship, but if you're abandoning it, I'm taking it." And within 2 days he had, I think, as I recall, 385 signatures of men who were big enough to say, "We'll remain long enough to help the weak, the helpless, and the poor." And Brigham Young himself, with one wagon, moved out 4 families. And at the first town they stopped in, Brigham Young had been out in the area looking for other families that hadn't been gathered in. And when he returned to his family, he found that one of his little girls, or one of his children, had been run over by the wagon the day before, had been given up as not being expected to live, but had been blessed, and she did survive. These were the heartbreaks that these people went through. Brigham Young successfully led the people out. He was barely in Nauvoo when the prophet said, "Lead the Quorum of the 12 to England and establish the church there in greater strength." And he did. It took him 4 months to get to New York with the malaria and everything he had in his body that was trying to discourage him, but he made it. He went to England, arrived there with 75 cents in his pocket. And in less than a year later, he left, over 4,000 people having been converted to the church, 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon having been published, 60,000 tracts of this church having been distributed, and the largest shipping companies in England seeking his favor to ship the immigrants to America. That was Brigham Young, whose name this university memorializes. And now one last thought. The greatest trial that ever came to Brigham Young and his wife was when he, with the other leaders of the church, were asked to participate in raising not one family, but several. The patriarchal order of marriage. That a great multitude of carefully reared, carefully tutored spirits could be ushered into the earth, which could become the leaven of a great commonwealth that God would establish in the earth for the blessing of all mankind. Would he do it? Yes, he'd do it. But he says, as he watched the caskets of the dead pass by his door, he envied them rather than attempt the great sacrifice that this would entail. But he did it. Later in Salt Lake City, under one roof, he organized over a dozen families, all bearing his name. His lovely wife presided. And in that house there was peace and there was order. And when he died, I have these few words from one of his daughters. The world knows Brigham Young as a statesman and colonizer, but to his children he was an ideal father. 53 children. Kind to a fault, tender, thoughtful, just, and firm. None of us feared him. All of us adored him. If the measure of a man's greatness is truly given by Carlyle as bounded by the number of those who loved him and who were loved by him, then few men are as great as was my father, Brigham Young. I pray through Jesus Christ. Amen.